Hello and welcome to the Problem Gambling Podcast. I'm Barry Grant, an addiction counselor with Extern Problem Gambling. My co-host is Claire Donegan, an expert by lived experience and recovery coach. And we're doing a comeback of the podcast after a long hiatus to do a special series focusing on women whose lives have been impacted by gambling harms in different ways. Uh, the idea being to launch our new service, the EmpowerHer Recovery Network, which is going to be run by Claire, to support women whose lives have been harmed by their own gambling. So today we have a very special guest all the way from Oklahoma in the States who's gotten up very early. Thank you very much, Christina, for getting up so early to join us. And it's Christina Cooke from the Girls Society. Many of you who listen to gambling recovery related podcasts will probably already be tuning in to the Broke Girls Society podcast. If you are not already doing that, please do. There's over 100 episodes of brilliant interviews and discussions on there. Please do check it out on all the various podcast platforms. And of course, Broke Girls Society also has a Facebook group which has regular meetings on there as well and other forms of support. So, Christina, thank you so much for joining us today. Claire, did you want to jump in with some questions for Christina?
I was hoping you could tell us about the journey, Christina, because we do talk about how gambling affects us a lot, but maybe what was it like before the gambling started? What did your life look like then?
Sure. Thanks for having me on. So before gambling really impacted my life, where I grew up, which is Oklahoma, is smack dab in the middle of the US of A, and it's gambling hasn't really impacted our landscape that much. Until probably the early 2000s. So my childhood and all of that stuff wasn't really impacted by gambling because we didn't have it in the amount that we have it now. So growing up, it wasn't like I was aware that gambling could be a problem, right? Of course, I'd watched, the movies like Casino and things like that, the kind of the mob gangster kind of movies of like, that gambling is there, what it is, but you don't really have an understanding, right? That it can be impactful. It's just entertainment or something you see people doing in the movies or, Vegas, right? Like everybody knows of Vegas. And it's not something that really I ever thought about growing up. So, and the reason why I'm sharing that is because it can look very different from somebody who grew up on the East Coast or somebody who grew up in, the UK, for instance. And it's just so it's a very different landscape in Oklahoma. So we had like horse racing at a couple of places, and we had um, like bingo houses or whatever. And I remember my mom playing bingo when I was younger. But again, it didn't really impact me. So I just went on about my life, right? And I found myself around 28 divorcing. I didn't have kids. Um, it wasn't working out. I was going through a divorce, and all my friends were getting married or having babies, and I just felt like really disconnected at the moment of where I was and where they were. And they had just started opening up casinos around me. I'm talking within the few years of my divorce. And so I had gone for like a girls' night out, a birthday party. It was never anything. It was always just okay, yeah, cool. I remember the first time that I went, I spent $5 and I was like, ah, this isn't worth it. And it smelled so bad in there because that was before they really even cared about like filter systems and things like that. So it was like a huge smoke hole. Like it was really bad. And I'm somebody with asthma, so it wasn't ever like a comfortable atmosphere for me. But then again, circling back to being, single at 28, not really connecting with my friends, they were on a different path. And so I found myself looking for something to do on the weekends, right? I wasn't somebody for the bars. And so I would go with my mom or I would go with, another relative. And and we'd go on the weekends. And for a while, I would say a good little while, it was just what it was meant for, entertainment, right? It was just something I did occasionally. It wasn't ever anything that had any power over my decision making or anything at that, when I first started gambling. And really, probably for the next several years, it was just kind of something I did, just to get out of the house. It didn't impact me financially. It didn't really impact me in a lot of different ways. And then I found myself in a really terrible relationship, a really abusive relationship. And the reason I'm saying it was tough for me to see. There wasn't physical violence. It was mental violence. It was verbal violence. It was tearing me down, building me up, tearing me down, building me up. So I was in this cycle and I didn't understand it. I didn't understand that it was abuse. I didn't understand that um, I didn't I didn't understand what was happening to me. And I didn't know at the time how to combat it or how to change it or how to, I was just really stuck in this. And so I found myself going to the casino more and more to escape kind of my own thoughts, feelings about what was going on in my life. Like I felt very powerless in that relationship. And I guess in a way, gambling made me feel like I was gaining some power back. I don't know. I'm still kind of like dissecting that whole situation, but for me, it was escapism, right? It was escaping what I was experiencing. And so that kind of continued on. I started building gambling as my coping mechanism for like just how I'm dealing with my life. And um, then about 7 years into my gambling, it started to kind of transition into harmful financially, mentally, spiritually, like in every way that addiction can harm you. That's when it started to kind of transition for me. And so for the next 7 years, I was in this vicious cycle of, um, gambling harm, financial harm, all these things. I was able to get out of that relationship, but I was so damaged by it. I just still wasn't making good choices. You know what I mean? So it was like all of these things, within about a 7 year period. And I finally found myself like at the point where, the dark thoughts were just coming more often. And I was trying to figure out, like, I tried to change so many things about my life, thinking, oh, well, this is it. This is it. Like, why am I not getting better? Why am I still harming myself in all these different ways? And so I would change something, and that wasn't it. Because I wasn't ready to address that gambling was really the problem, because it was also my coping mechanism. So it's like if I addressed that gambling was the problem, then I would lose the gambling, and I didn't know how I was going to cope without the gambling. And it was just like I said, this vicious cycle. But I was also so sick and tired of being sick and tired. And finally, when I was um, about 42, so this is 15 years into my relationship with gambling, um, I I just was so exhausted and so tired and just, I didn't want to be here anymore. And that's the easiest way I can say that is I just didn't want to be here anymore. And I was watching a show late at night after a gambling, I devastated myself gambling again. And it was middle of the night. I was watching a show about food addiction. We have a show over here called My 600-Pound Life. And it's like this show that follows people who have food addiction. And I was watching it, and this woman was describing her feelings of the anticipation of the meal, right? She couldn't wait to eat. Like that's all she thought about. And then once she got the meal, how she felt the food, the euphoria of that. And then how she felt after she ate the pizza, the whole pizza, and everything else, like all this food, the self-loathing, the self-hate. And I connected with each and every one of those emotions for my gambling, right? I couldn't wait to get there. And once I was there, you have that dopamine and all of that. And then after that, you're driving home and just the self-loathing. Like, how could I be so stupid? How could I do this again? Like, why do I keep doing this to myself? And it was just like, that was the first time it really connected with me that I had a problem. Like, I know you probably think, oh, 7 years of this, you would think, but I never thought gambling could be addictive. I never thought gambling could destroy my life. I hadn't really experienced anybody in addiction. I didn't know. And it's like, yeah, I knew there was a problem. I just thought I couldn't control my finances. I just thought the problem was me, right? I didn't think it was anything else. And so when I connected with that moment, it was like, okay, I've got to change this. And so I said, I'm not going to gamble. I'm going to just cold turkey it. I didn't even know recovery was a thing, right? So I made it about 60 days and I thought, oh, I've got this. I've got this. I'm good, right? I made it 60 days, no betting. And I crashed. Like I decided to go and it was a week-long binge and it was like on the verge of mania. Like I couldn't stop. And that was the first, like I had had thoughts of self-harm, but that was the real first time that I scared myself with the thoughts of self-harm. Like I really didn't want to be here anymore. And I picked up my phone because I knew I was going to have a dozen missed calls. I'd been MIA all week and um and a picture of my mom and my sisters was on my phone from my sister's wedding. And I just knew that I didn't want to leave them. I couldn't do this to them. And so it's like I knew that I had to change. And I went to my mom the next morning and I told her what had been going on with me. She'd known, like I'd said, she'd gambled with me, but she had thought I'd stopped. When she was seeing the problems, I was borrowing money all the time, all the signs, right? And so I was very, very honest. And that was probably the first time that I'd really been honest in a long time. And she said, we're going to figure this out. And you don't have to do this alone. She knew of somebody who'd gone to GA and she had told me about the program. And so I had called the 1-800 number here in the States and got the meeting info. And within a week, I had found a counselor and had attended my first GA meeting. I actually went on gamblersandrecovery.com like that night and like crashed a meeting and somebody was very nice with me, but I didn't really understand that it was a GA meeting or anything like that. So I went to my first in-person meeting within that first week. And that's kind of, I'll give you guys a little space to ask me some questions since I just gave you my whole uh, Cliff Notes version there. But yeah, so
Yeah, well, it was really well explained, so thank you for that. And the whole time you were speaking, there's so much of that. I just thought, I've been there. I've been there. I totally relate to everything you're saying. Um, and it is crazy, like how do you feel that GA, how did that work for you? Like when you got to that first meeting, like what was the recovery stage like then?
yeah, well, I always like to share my first experience, right? Because I don't know if you hear this or not, but a lot of times there's a lot of fear going into in-person meetings, right? Or like, what door do I go in? Or like, how do I, because you're so scared. Like I was shaking to go to my first GA meeting. Like I was shaking. I didn't know what to expect. And that's the thing a lot of times that keeps us from going to the next step is like the fear, right? How do we move through the fear of something we don't know? And so for me, I was shaking and I had called and it said, go to this door and it's just around the corner. I'm like, okay, I just needed to know which way to go. Because I'm in survival mode. I can't really overthink. I mean, I can't have to think about this too much or I'm gonna withdraw, right? So I um went to the door and it was locked. I felt so defeated in that moment. Like this might, to a normal person, they're like, why didn't you try another door? Why didn't you walk around? Why didn't you just keep doing this? But when you're so overwhelmed with fear and like you're struggling, you're in survival mode, your brain is mush, like just the simplest deterrent can turn you around. And that's what I try and explain to a lot of people. If you make this difficult in these moments, people are going to be like, I can't do this. I can't do this. You know what I mean? And so even a locked door can be a deterrent, if you don't say it's the right door. And So I started to kind of walk back to my car, and then I saw somebody pull up on a different side of the building, and then I kind of watched them and what door they went in. And I'm like, I've got to give myself this chance. I drove all the way here, 35 minutes away to do this. So I went around to the building. And on the website, it was completely wrong. But I just followed this guy in, and I was just gonna, if I could just get in, I was gonna figure it out, right? So I got in, found the meeting, and it was a room full of men. And which wasn't that didn't like really discourage me as much in the beginning because I just needed to hear what this was about. So I sat down, and these men were great. They were kind. I didn't have a bad experience in that way. Um, but they had, 10 years on me. As far as recovery goes, they probably had 30 years on me as far as age goes. And so, it was great. That was the very first time that I felt like really heard and seen and validated with my experience. And that was very, very important for me and for what led me to continue on. Um, and I stayed with that meeting for a year of going, and I went every Saturday morning. Like it was just I needed that mile marker. I needed that guiding post, and that's what it was for me. But when I left that meeting that very first time, I knew because it was a 35-minute meeting from the start to the finish. Like it was yellow book, everything, and it was great. It was what I needed at the time, but I knew I was going to need more because I was going through so much. And the short meeting with no conversation, like, yeah, we got to do a little share. Um, but I just knew I was going to need more. And so when I left that, I started looking online for for women's groups or something that I knew I wanted to be surrounded by women who were navigating this path. Um, and I didn't really find it. And it was very discouraging. I didn't find women talking about this. I was like, and that kind of made me feel like I was again alone, right? Oh, great. Now I'm the only woman that can't do this right? And it's that thinking, but then it's like I got back to thinking about it and I'm like, I was surrounded by women at the casino. Every side of me was a woman. Like the whole place, as far as the slot machines go, I would say was 65, 70% women. And I'm like, how can I be the only one? But still, I was like, well, if I can't find one, then maybe I'll just share my story online and maybe I'll find somebody that way, kind of thinking maybe somebody will see that I'm struggling with this. They'll reach out and I'll have a buddy, kind of thing. Um, and then a podcaster reached out to me and she had experienced gambling harm amongst some other addiction. And she did a podcast and she's like, which I'd already started listening to podcasts, but they were very, again, male dominated. And she invited me on her podcast. I loved the conversation. I loved her. Like, um, and I thought, I could do this. I could podcast. Like hers wasn't gambling specific. And I thought I could do a podcast, kind of take my little online vlogs to do this because I loved the process of it. And so, yeah, that's kind of the beginning of my recovery. It's also the beginning of the Broke Girl Society podcast.
Amazing, like to hear how that actually came about, and very, very sad also to know that it took you so much effort to find that at the same time, and we're not talking that long ago. Is it less than 3 years?
It's just a little over 3.5 years now.
3.5 years. Yeah. So, I mean, you would think, and like you described, the fact that the casinos were full of the women, but this is going to bring it back to the shame and the stigma. And I suppose, almost like you were saying before, the fact that you don't really realize you have a problem, no matter how bad your life is getting at that point. I mean, I think the thing with GA is it is a starting point for a lot of women who may not always want to stay there because there is that male aspect of it. Not, and I don't think that's intentional. It's just a place where men tend to go to. But Like, so funny. Like, you're describing my life in so many ways, Christina. Like, I remember going to that GA meeting. Someone I knew brought me there, and I felt that resistance going there. And I had never tried to get any sort of help at this point either. And you would have taken, well, I probably would have taken any excuse to not go in that door. And the reason I remember this meeting so well is, yes, I walked in, it was full of men, didn't bother me. But from the second I walked in that door, I cried the entire time. I cried so much that the jumper I was wearing, I had to pull over my face and just hide my face the whole time I was in there because I had no idea how you could connect emotionally with other people's stories as well, and how they could respect yours. And I never said a word in that meeting. But I felt that kind of first connection, I suppose. But again, there's no sign of a woman anywhere, which was quite disappointing, I suppose. Um, but I think like your journey and like I mean you're talking about what 7 months into your recovery, you were saying you were thinking the idea of sharing your story online. I mean, that is so brave at that
Wasn't
point in
even
your
seven
recovery.
months. It wasn't even
Really?
7 months. I started sharing on Instagram 60 days in.
Wow.
Like 60 days in, maybe even earlier. I can't even remember. It might have even been 30 days in. I started kind of sharing and building up my Instagram. Because like when that switch flipped for me of like, I've got to change. And it's pretty rare when you talk to somebody who's able to kind of be like, flip this switch of like, I'm not going to gamble again to I've got to change. I've got to find recovery. I've got to do these things because that's not everybody's story. But for me, something happened and so I wanted to be accountable. And so I started doing the Instagram, right? And then she reached out to me. I think I did her podcast 60 days in. I had the first episode of the Broke Girl Society 4 months. And so I entered recovery March 6th and I released the first episode July 1st. So it was like once I like for me, I think it was just a part of my recovery I needed, right? Like it was just another piece of accountability for me. And I thought, I'm just going to share it, as I continue on and yeah, so it was actually earlier than that.
That's amazing. Like, I mean, I would say I was definitely nearly a year in before I even thought about like the first thing I did um was take part in a research project and but again it was great because it was all about women and researching women's gambling and I met some great people through it and that's how I started kind of working in this area. But I did like getting that connection with women. None of them were Irish. But it was nice, and there is a lot to be said for that. I mean, going from where you are now in your recovery, do you ever feel like you miss the gambling? Do you ever feel like there's times where you go, oh, I'd love to do that again? Or are you completely repulsed by the idea? Do you feel like that temptation ever comes in now?
Yeah, it does. I think the first year of my recovery, I did really well up until around the holidays. And there was like a lot of like nostalgia, you get a lot of time off work, you get usually extra money with like Christmas bonuses and holiday bonuses. Um, so yeah, I had that first year, I had a little bit of like nostalgia related, like, oh, I wish I could go with my family because like I have family members who gamble and it was just like I mean, and my mom was occasionally doing it. She really doesn't since I've entered recovery, but it was still, just something that kind of that connection as far as just that. But then it's like when I have those moments, I have to tell myself, well, you never saw them in there anyway. Like we all might like go together, we might eat, but then you don't talk to them, you don't see them, you're all doing your own thing. And then you get cranky if somebody comes up on you and like all these things. So it's remembering like for me, the addiction wants to kind of show me, I kind of look at it like a real play of like the good. Like it's like, oh, remember all this? Like this was all great. And then I'm like, I have to remember like the D clip where it's like the real thing where it wasn't what what my mind is trying to make it out to be, or what the addiction is trying to make it out to be. And so I have all these little kind of tricks to remind myself that nope, it's not what, you're trying to show me. It's so much worse. And, you know, even just recently, I think maybe back in April, I was driving to a conference in another state, Arkansas, and I took my mom with me for that one because I was a keynote speaker and I wanted her to see kind of the work that I was doing. And so, plus Arkansas is a beautiful state. And, driving down there, we passed like anybody who's in the surrounding states of Oklahoma, we have 143, 44 casinos now in our state. And they're really heavier on the state lines, right? Because like Texas doesn't have casinos. So they're real heavier on the state lines. And so anytime you're getting close to a state line of Oklahoma, you start seeing the billboards. Turn here, exit here, and like all these billboards. And then you would see the casinos. And I always have this thought of like, I wonder what it looks like in there, or I wonder what the games look like now. So, but it's not this compulsion to gamble. It's just curiosity on and kind of wanting to maybe go back to that feeling of, what it was like on the good times at the casino, maybe. I don't know. But I always push myself through it. Recently, I was in Las Vegas for the Nevada conference. And that was a real trip because I really hadn't been like face to face with gambling because I don't go in the casinos here. And I was curious, how I was going to react when I got there. And it was very emotional for me. Like 3 years into recovery, you think, because it was right at 3 years for me when I went there. You would think, oh, I've got this, right? Like, I've got this. I drive by casinos every day. Like, I talk about gambling in some capacity every day. Like, I've got this. And the minute I stepped into that resort where we were staying, which is also a casino, it was like, boom. It was like I was hit in the face with like all the trauma of my gambling. And it was very emotional, but I had my partner with me. He was very supportive. I have Brian Hatch with me, who's my co-host on the Bet Free Life and also put out the first gambling addiction podcast. So he was there with me. He was 10 years in recovery, celebrated 10 years in recovery. And, we made it through, but it was hard. It was challenging. And I never wanted to gamble though. It's just sometimes what gets me is the impact of my gambling still sometimes lingers.
That is something that you and I have discussed at length before, is that legacy harm. And I'm always banging on about legacy harm, but you've described it as PTSD that you feel from your addiction. And I feel that completely with you. And like, you've made so many good points on that in the past. And one story that really sticks out to me, because I still do this myself every time I go to the shop, is when you describe that, like, you go into the shop, you check your bank account. Before you go to the till, you check your bank account because you're terrified that the money isn't in there. I still do that,
I do too.
and I'm 4 years into recovery. And those are little things that, people don't realize, that impact, that psychological effect that it has afterwards. And I probably might even do that in 10 years' time, because I just need to know that it's there, or something hasn't just gone out last minute that I wasn't aware of. So, that it's just an important point to make. I think that these are little barriers you will have to face, but also it's a much better position to be in than not having the money in the bank account.
100%. I still do it. And what I'm realizing too, since we're kind of on this PTSD conversation here, is even just recently, because I quit my full-time job to do work in this space. And here in the US, it's a very different structure. We don't have funding for gambling recovery. There's no federal funding. Everything's kind of down to the state. And so the states dictate, whatever they collect and what. So some states have really great programs, some states don't have programs at all. So it's like, so for me to get funding to do this, it's not like there's charities and things like that who fund these types of programs. Everything I've done from the start of the podcast to building up the Broke Girl Society support groups and doing those meetings and everything that I've done in this space, I've done on my own. And it's, without like I'll bring a sponsorship into the podcast and that helps kind of offset some of like the conference stuff and travel, but it's still very much on me, right? To do these things. And there's a lot that goes into that. And when there's no funding to help me, so I left my job, my full-time job, because I was being pulled in so many directions and I'm so passionate about this work. I thought maybe I can kind of pull together some contract work and kind of do this. Well, what that has really brought out in me is like a scarcity mindset with my finances. And I've had to go back into therapy to help me navigate that. And that is a response from the scarcity of finances that I caused myself all those years gambling, right? Like we'd gamble our last penny and then have to figure out how to live for 2 weeks. And, just that scrambling and that survival mode and like just harm, trying to pull yourself out of the harm just to put yourself back into the harm again. And that cycle lasted for a very long time. And even though I'm 3.5 years out of recovery and things look very different for me, especially financially, there's still all this stuff that comes up. And it's like, especially around, oh no, what am I going to do? Am I going to have to make the choice to go back to work full time or can I hold out and try and do this? And, that really triggered a lot of PTSD in me and a lot of, very unhealthy kind of responses to just that. And it's just interesting, when you talk about the legacy harms or just how we can be impacted several years later, it's just really important to work my recovery so that I have the support that I need and I feel safe when things come up because I can see where the relapses happen or regression or resurging, whatever the term is these days. But I can see how people end up 5 years into it going back to gambling because they're not building out these tools, right? To help us identify when we're triggered or when we're, struggling.
Absolutely. Barry, did you want to ask anything there?
Yeah, I mean, it's got so much in there, Christina. I mean, just the last thing you were speaking about, the trauma of the consequences, and you know, I suppose when we experience trauma, we then create patterns of similar situations that remind us of the traumatic event. So it doesn't have to be exactly the same; it just has to be kind of in the ballpark. So yeah, when you're in similar type situations, it just comes flooding back, and it's really intense. And even the fact that you're finding yourself kind of go back into therapy at the moment, which is healthy. But I think for a lot of people, it's that Claire talks a lot about the legacy harms, but it's that it's that extremely long hangover from gambling that maybe you don't get with other addictions to the same degree. The tail of the consequences can be very long and enduring. And I think that's I've spoken to a few people in the States over the years. Say that in Pennsylvania, I did some training with them with their counsel on compulsive gambling, I think they call it, and the guys down in the gambling clinic in Tennessee, and that's going back a few years, and that the kind of piecemeal nature, I suppose, the federal nature of the states being that each state decides how much money they're going to put into gambling addiction services, for want of a better term, uh, is problematic. I can imagine it's difficult on the ground. Would Oklahoma be worse or better than some of the other states or some of the neighboring states in that regard?
Oklahoma, it's probably in the middle. Like Pennsylvania has amazing resources. The gambling clinic, they're a sponsor of the podcast. Like they are that's amazing group of people. Um, you know, New York has amazing resources. Oregon, Washington, they all have like some of these states have really good resources. Louisiana, Minnesota, but Oklahoma, so Oklahoma did 3.4 billion in gambling revenue last year. $3.4 billion in gambling revenue. And that's just one state. One state. And though we're kind of up there, with Nevada and New Jersey as far as like the amount of machines and gambling options we have, Um, Only $750,000. So, okay, let me backtrack. 177 million goes to the state for taxes and that. So out of that 177 million, $750,000 goes to recovery in our state. Well, they just released a survey or a study, and I'm drawing a blank on it, but it's one of those really extensive studies, and it shows that 6% of the adult population of Oklahoma is struggling in some way with problem gambling. And we're a pretty large state. So it's like 750,000. Like, yeah, that's a lot of money, but when you have a 6% impact rate, I think it's averaging 120,000 adults here in our state. You know, it's not a lot of money in the grand scheme of things and the treatment costs and things like that. So our state will cover your therapy bill basically if you don't have insurance. It's only if you don't have insurance. So still it's not great. We don't have, we have GA here, but it's sporadic and it's not, it's in the big cities. So which is we have two big cities, which is Tulsa and Oklahoma City. And so if you're outside of those, like you're not going to have an in-person meeting. Um, which is why Zoom meetings are so fantastic, because it gives you that opportunity. But as far as like additional resources, now if you're native or, part of the native population, like they have a lot more programs, but you have to be native to engage in those programs. And most of Oklahoma is not. So it's like, there's a lot of, there's a lot of barriers
Yeah.
to getting help.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the 3.4 billion is a lot. Um, I it wouldn't have crossed my mind that Oklahoma would be that close to Nevada in terms of gambling revenue, or New Jersey, which is a long-standing history of legalized gambling as well. And like in the UK, what they're talking about doing is, and we're talking about doing something similar in Ireland, is a levy on gambling industry turnover. So again, if it's 1%, say, what would that be? Never do maths live on a podcast in your head, but I'm thinking it's 34 million will be 1% of the 3.4 billion, but I'm open to correction on that. But it would be substantially more than the 750,000. And you could actually start doing some really meaningful stuff. Because when the amount of money is that small, it tends to be put into the firefighting end, which is the end where all the people are in absolute crisis, and we'll do a bit of firefighting. Again, that's the kind of work that I do every day. So I'm not I'm not being
Right.
negative. I'm not being negative about that kind of work. It's important work. It has to happen. But it means that whatever few resources you have to go there. And there's nothing happening at the prevention end. There's nothing happening at the education end. There's very little or nothing happening at the research end. Nothing happening at the policy end in terms of government saying, "Oh, hang on, what policies can we put in to prevent harm?" So yeah, hopefully that will improve.
I
Hopefully
hope
that
so
situation will
too.
change.
And we don't
Where,
even have online gambling. We don't have online gambling or sports betting. That is just casino revenue. So it's like, and a lot of states have, online gambling, and sports betting. And I think they've been trying to get sports betting in. So once they get sports betting in, it will probably happen in the next few years. Once they get sports betting in, then they're going to be like, oh, they're going to make their play for online gambling, which we do have a casino here that has an online app that you can use on their reservation or their properties. So like you can literally go to their parking lot and use their app at the casino. And I remember there was a state senator. This is our politics here in the great state of Oklahoma, and I do love Oklahoma, so I'm not being negative. Um, the policies, politics, maybe not so much, but he mentioned he's like, isn't it fantastic that you can now, if your machine is full, somebody's sitting on your machine, you can just go to the parking lot and play the same game in your car. And I'm just like, oh boy. Like we have so much work to do because if somebody's sitting in the parking lot of a casino playing on their phone, like that's just a recipe for how do you get addicted? 101. You go and you isolate yourself and you know what I mean? It's like if somebody's setting it goes against the whole practice of like this is just for entertainment, you know, that kind of thing, right? We take them out of the social situation and we isolate them and yeah, there's your roadmap.
Were you surprised, Christina, when you started the podcast, how popular it became?
You know, yeah, I'm still surprised. When I first put it out, I think I had 20 listens on that, 20 some listens on that first episode. And my first episode, very scary, and it was just me, and it was very vulnerable. It took me 50 times to record that. And but most of those listens were probably my family, to support me. And then here we are, over 3 years, we just released the on my 3 year anniversary of doing the podcast, I did the 100th episode of the podcast. And I also we're just shy of 250,000 downloads of the podcast. So it's like all these things have happened in the last 3 years. And yeah, it still surprises me.
But and like, what would you say your quality of life over those 3.5 years is like? I mean, my point here is there's a certain way you live your life when you're addicted, right? Or, well, when you're gambling, and just everything is this like robotic response to how you live your life. You're on autopilot all the time. You're not present at anything. What are your relationships like now with people? How do you find things have changed?
Yeah, it's very, very different. Like when I was first in recovery, I was in a marriage that wasn't working. It was falling apart. We were both struggling with addiction. And I just remember, when I finally came clean, it was like I was 60 months into working with 60 days into working with my therapist about how to tell him that I was, had gambled. And I didn't really impact him financially as much as I impacted myself. But he was impacted because I spent all our money. And though I didn't rack up debt in his name and those types of things, it was still like I had to explain the harm I'd done, right? And I just remember his response was, "This is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Nobody's addicted to gambling. Like you just can't control your money." And so it was like in that moment, I'd worked so hard to get to that point to bring him into it so that I can continue to build on my recovery and not do it in secret, like I was going to meetings in secret and doing all these things in secret. And I was tired of being in secret. I was tired of living my life in the shadows. And to have that response, like it was just another piece that kind of broke me, in that moment. And it was just kind of like, okay, well, this is one more thing I've got to address. This is one more thing I've got to add to my list. And um, so that was another piece of why I needed more support, people who understood, because I was going to my GA meetings crying too, and they were like, they're there, they're there, like they weren't really connecting with what was going on. And so it was like I had to navigate that, right? And my therapist was like, "Don't do any major decisions in the first year of your recovery. Let's work on these other things. Let's get you in a place that you can make a decision and move forward with it, And so I did that, and then I was like, "Nope, like this needs to change." And so I ended that relationship, lived on my own for a year, and that was really scary to me, right? Because of all the financial harm that I had caused myself, like to have to now be solely responsible for my rent, for my, necessities, all these things. So that year was very important to me. I made every rent payment on time. I, started working on all these other aspects of my finances. I really worked on me. And then now it's like I worked on me, I worked on building the BGS, I worked on, you know, my advocacy work and all these different things. And I really started to grow as a person because when I was in addiction, I was very stale. I didn't grow as a human. I just worked, gambled, existed, worked, gambled, existed, this kind of cycle. And now I'm doing all these things. I'm reading again. I'm, you know, unisolated. I'm going out into the world. I'm doing all these things for me. I'm growing, I'm learning all these things. And then I met somebody, and that was really scary for me because it was like, well, first, how do I tell this person that I do this work? How do I tell this person that I've spent years in addiction? How do I navigate this? But then it was like, I'm just going to be out with it from the beginning because I don't want to hide anymore. this is me. This is something I'm doing. Like, and I did. And it's like, I can understand if you don't want to date somebody like me and they're like somebody who has changed their life and is really putting in the effort to do better. Like, yeah, that's so unattractive. And so when he said that, it was just so very different from like being called stupid to being like, this is amazing, you know? And so all this work that I've done has just led me to a place of like, I'm going to exist for me and I'm going to be honest and open and do these things. Are there still challenges in how I navigate? Sure. I still don't like conflict. I still can find myself trying to find ways out of conflict instead of, I can still see some behaviors that need to be worked on. But that's the difference, right? Doing all this work, you become more aware of how you need to navigate life in a healthy way because my whole philosophy is I'm building a life I don't want to escape from. I'm not going to add things that are going to make me run or avoid. Like that's what's changed the most is I'm not going to escape and I'm not going to allow my life to be something I need to escape from. And, you know, that's my philosophy these days.
I love your philosophy and it's so encouraging as well. And it's really nice to hear that, like you approach that, you went, you know what, this is who I am and he's gonna love it or he's gonna hate it. But you were accepting of that situation because you're presenting who you are now. And you can see the growth in that and the sometimes niggling, annoying awareness we have of our own behaviors, but it's there nonetheless. So I think that's
Yeah.
a great point to address as well. Um, can you just talk a little bit about the Facebook group that you have? Because I know how popular it is. So what have you found like I know there's a lot of women that come to you, and I know that they come to you from all over the world through this Facebook group. So what are you noticing? What do you feel like is going on with them, or what are they coming to you with like that they really are struggling with?
Yeah, I mean it's really I didn't expect that part of it. I wanted to create some support for people who were listening to the podcast. I didn't really anticipate it being, what it is as far as like having weekly meetings. We're fixing to add a second weekly meeting. And I just never anticipated that it would become this place of like hope and I wanted it to be I wanted it to be that, but you just never know, right? And so, like, my podcast is listened to, I think, in over 70 countries the last time my stats were sent to me. And it was like, so I have people in the group from so many different countries. I think a majority is still going to be US based. So I would say 70% is US. And then next to that would probably be Canada, and then the UK, Australia, the Philippines, like all over. And it's just, I don't know, it just is this really beautiful space that I think the atmosphere in it is very much encouraging support. Like, let's really understand where everybody's coming from and the way these women show up. So when the group first started, I was the one responding to everything. It was very much on me to make sure these people felt seen, heard. I took it very personally, and I still take the group and their safety very personally because when we're talking about women, to say that the only safe space for you is in a space that might have men and you've been impacted or harmed at the hands of a man, to say, oh well, this is all we have for you and it's a GA group full of men, like that doesn't feel very fair, right? It doesn't feel very safe for the woman. And so that's why it's so important for me for the BGS to be women specific. The meetings are women specific. We do have a few fellas in the group because they just do better with female energy, but they aren't invited to the meetings. Like the meetings are very women only, women centric. We talk about things like how to navigate relationships, how to tell your partner. We talk about things of mom guilt, right? How do you date in recovery? We talk about all these things that aren't normally talked about in, a GA group that might have male and female, right? So it's just like how to navigate relationships with friends and how to, like, a lot of times there's toxic friendships where your gambling's tied in to your relationship or your friendships, or maybe your mom likes to go gambling every day and she needs you to drive her, and it's like, well, how do you navigate that? And And I always encourage that this is not a replacement for professional treatment. Like this is just additional support to go hand in hand with your treatment. So we're not like getting out of our lanes in a way, but we're also there, like we're there to support from our own experiences, right? Like this is how I did it. This could be helpful, or just to kind of serve as that support and like, hey, I've been there. Validate what they're going through.
I think that, that's the point, isn't it? Like we're n- we're not professionals, but we can offer something that is really important in recovery, which is connection and understanding. And sometimes that can be the biggest barrier. So once you find that, everything else nearly opens up around it. I felt anyway. Um, so I love everything you just said there. And I know that you are probably flat out with the group all the time. That's probably taking a lot of your time, but you have this new outlook on life. So what would you say? What would you advise people who are at that very first stage now, at the locked door, people who want to get into recovery? What do you think is the best step forward, or what would you advise?
Yeah, I would say, I know how scary it is to come up to barriers, right? To your goals, to what you want. Like, and especially in early recovery when you're just trying to do the right thing, right? You're trying to make a choice that's healthier than the choice maybe you made that got you there. And so I think for me, when I encounter this with women who are just trying to figure out what's next, is, get involved with that connection, right? Get involved with, even if you're just trying to explore it right now, you don't really want it in your face, you just want to kind of explore it, see what it looks like, find yourself a Facebook group, or just be really curious about what could be next? What is impacting you? Like, be curious about, if I do go to this meeting, like, maybe I can just go to it, listen in, and then decide. You don't have to decide anything before you get there. Just be open-minded, be curious. If you find a deterrent, you know, figure out how to get around it. Like, don't stop. I guess the biggest advice, and I'm not sure if I'm making myself clear, is don't stop when you find a deterrent. Like, figure out what's next. If GA isn't for you, okay, what could be next? There's so many different avenues of recovery. There's not just one way. And I think that that's kind of the tide of things these days. Like before, you're even just maybe 3, 4 years ago, the only thought of recovery was GA, right? Like that's it. That's what everybody does. Like that's all we know. And it's like it's so much more than that. You've got recovery dharma, you've got celebrate recovery, you've got all these different, like recovery dharma is more of a spiritual kind of Buddha style recovery. You've got celebrate recovery, which is Christian based. You've got GA, which is fellowship based. You've got all these different recovery outlets. You've got recovery meetings online 24/7. So there's always going to be, you've got that blocking software for your phones. You've got apps that can help you navigate your behaviors or learn more about gambling. Like as technology pushes us, makes gambling easier, it also makes recovery easier. So it's like, there's always going to be something. And your journey doesn't have to look like the other person's. Like, take that off the table. It needs to look like what you need. And for me, a combination of working with a therapist who's trained in gambling addiction, working with peer support, if you have those type of programs, building yourself a type of community of people who understand, like those are going to be the things that really make a difference in whether or not you have a solid foundation of recovery, right? That's what you build off of. And, you really just focus on not looking at recovery as a life sentence, but as a life you get to live and the life that you want to live. And so that's my whole like perspective when I'm talking to somebody. I'm like, all right, well, you didn't have a good time at GA. You can try another meeting, you can try this, but, don't be like, oh, that didn't work for me. Nothing's going to work for me. Find something that will. There is something that will. You just have to want it. You just have to want it. And when you want it, you figure it out. And that's the honest to goodness truth.
Yeah, that's great advice. And like the idea that there's just one kind of cookie cutter size fits all recovery, that everybody has to do that. And if I think that's a big part of the problem for some people, because then they think, well, this isn't working for me, therefore I'm broken because, 100 years of the 12 step movement can't be the thing that's broken. It must be me or whatever. I went to this terrible therapist, and I've been to some terrible therapists. So they're out there, believe me. But
Exactly.
and it's not helping me in my recovery. Therefore, I'm the broken one because the therapist, they've got a degree. They can't be the one that's the wrong one in this equation. It doesn't have to be a terrible therapist. It could just be the what they call the therapeutic relationship or the rapport that you build with the therapist just isn't working. You're not clicking. They don't have to be bad at their job necessarily, but like there's all these variables and all these unquantifiables that mean that like that there may be multiple locked doors, unfortunately, along the way. Hopefully not, and hopefully if there are some, hopefully there's not too many, but there may be some. Right? But like you said, like if you want to just keep going, try the next door, try the next thing,
Yep.
try like that. Fortunately now, even I think Claire, in your experience, like you would have seen it as well, like in the last 5 to 10 years, there are so many different options, so many different types of support, be it different podcasts, be it Facebook groups, other recovery groups. You mentioned a few there. Smart Recovery would also support people around gambling and substance use. Like this, there's just more options becoming available, which means there's more doors, right? So you just keep trying to open the doors until you find the right one or the combination of ones that's going to work for you. But I think that you're giving great advice there. And I love that idea of building a life that you don't want to escape from, because especially we're kind of primarily talking about slot machine or machine gambling today, and that's generally considered to be escape gambling. But a lot of people who gamble bet on sports are using that as a form of escape as well, or as you were talking about the coping mechanism earlier on. So I take away my coping mechanism for stuff, which is gambling. How do I cope without coping mechanism? Like this is at the nub of any kind of recovery from any addiction. So there's loads and loads of great advice out there. And just one last thing, you talked about, not getting out of your lane. I don't think there is a lane, or there shouldn't be a lane. Like there's just people who are trying different ways to support other people in similar situations. So hopefully there isn't too much of a lane. I don't try not to think of it that way. Claire, before we finish up for today, any final thoughts or questions? Or you, Christine, any final thoughts?
I just feel like every time I like talk to Christina and listen to her, it's like she's telling my story. She's just like you describe it really well, those feelings and those experiences. And I always understand exactly what you're saying. And I think that's what's great about having you on today is that so many other people are going to feel that too and understand that too. Because sometimes you can't really find the right words to describe what you're feeling. And I feel like you've done that for me in a lot of ways today, and hopefully a lot of other people who will relate to what you said and be able to reach out and get the support they need. Because the point, like exactly what you said, you don't have to commit to anything. Check it out, do your research, have a listen to a podcast episode, even maybe go to a meeting and just see how you feel. Because it's like day by day, whatever way you look at it. So yeah, I love the way you described that today. And yeah, thank you so much, Christina. Really.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. And I think, all one of the things that I really enjoy doing in the podcast and everything that I do, it's like planting that seed of like, hey, maybe things can be different. Because I remember feeling so stuck in this box or in this wheel of like, I can't change anything, right? Like I can't change anything. This is just my life. To now, like I've hopped off that wheel, I've blown off the top of the box, and I'm like, I'm doing something I never thought possible, and that's working for myself and advocating for women in this space. And it's like not somebody's dream goal to experience addiction and then, help others on the other side of it. But for me, it's like I had to go through what I went through to find this passion that's now allowing me to do this work and to help others. And it's just kind of really understanding my journey. I think that gives me that self-awareness to really dig deep and just understand, you know, the emotions, the feelings. Because when you look at the group, like we're all kind of interconnected. Like we can all relate to some part of somebody's story. And a lot of it is just the compulsion and the loss of control and, even the powerlessness, which a lot of women don't like to really talk about, feeling powerlessness, but it's, we can all relate and connect. And I think that way it's what makes all these conversations so beautiful. And I just really appreciate you allowing me to come on and yeah, talk.
Thank you so much, Christina.
Thanks a million, Christina. And everyone, please, if you're into these types of podcasts and these types of conversations, please do check out the Broke Girl Society podcast. Over 100 episodes. Because I know from talking to clients over the years, they'll get to the end of some podcast and they'll run out of episodes and they're always asking me for recommendations. So here's a recommendation. Please do check out the podcast. And of course, there's a Facebook page as well, which has, was 1.3 thousand members, or is it much more than that? I think that I was doing some
It's
searching
almost
on
20. We're just under 2,300 right now.
2,300. Oh my God, yeah. So you will be in good company in the Facebook group as well if you want to check that out too. And just a reminder, this series is to promote our own new service, the EmpowerHer Recovery Network. And if you go to problemgambling.ie, there will be a link to that new service on the homepage. So thanks again, Christina Cooke, all the way from Oklahoma, for giving of your time so generously today. And thank you, dear listener, for tuning in. Thank you, and bye.